Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third episode of the Benjamin's Exotics Reptile Podcast. And in today's podcast, we're going to be discussing what makes a reptile species a good morph market. And by morph market, I'm not talking about the website Morph Market. As many people in the United States know, Morph Market has, as a website, become a huge platform for reptile breeders and keepers to basically sell animals and show people the projects they're working on. I'm not talking about Morph Market as a website. I'm talking about reptile markets as in, morph markets. Like, how do you make a reptile species become a ball python market? How do you develop a species to become a leopard gecko market, or a boa constrictor market, or a red-eared slider market, or a Pac-Man frog market? How do you get a species to go from just XYZ species to actually having a legitimate market? And why do some species develop into morph markets like ball pythons and leopard geckos and crested geckos and different species like this, and other species, even though they're great species and they're great captives, even after decades of people keeping them and breeding them, they just never develop into a legitimate, big, or at least sizable morph market? So there are many reasons for this, obviously, and we're going to kind of look at the biggest reasons of why a species develops into a morph market or why a species fails to develop into a morph market. And obviously there is a certain part of luck involved with it, and many times there are pioneers, for any sort of species to become a market. Like the ball python market would not be where it is today without Brian Barczyk, Kevin McCurley, and a lot of the first pioneers. Same thing with leopard geckos. The leopard gecko market wouldn't be where it is today without some of the early pioneers like Ron Tremper, who is just a god as far as leopard gecko morphs are concerned. So there are small things like that, just the luck of a breeder choosing a species to really work on hard for decades. But we're going to look at the really big overall factors that are controllable. It's just pure luck that a certain breeder chooses to work with a species, but there are concrete things that help a species or hurt a species as far as whether or not it will develop into a morph market. So there's really going to be two main parts to this podcast that I want to talk about. And the first part is going to be the animal in question, the species in question, whether it be a reptile or amphibian, must be something that can actually be kept and cared for by a large group of people. That doesn't mean the largest group of people. That doesn't even mean a, enormous worldwide group of people. It just means there actually needs to be a market available for that species. Because let's be honest, if it's just one person in a bedroom or in a basement or something like that, breeding a bunch of morphs, but nobody else wants to breed them and nobody wants to buy them or trade with them, then it's not really a market at all, is it? It's just somebody having a little side project that they're working on, which is fine, but we're looking at, how do you actually develop a huge or at least medium-sized morph market that you're going to have a lot of different people interested in that project? So the first part of this video, like I said, is going to be talking about the species actually has to be something that people want to keep in general, just the mechanics of that species alone. And after we go through that segment, which is the part one of the video, the second part is going to be the much bigger and broader part and the main chunk of this podcast, which is going to be the species must have the potential for color morph creation. There are so many species out there that are wonderful animals. They do great in captivity. They're easy to breed. They're easy to care for. They're just like the perfect best species around, but because of the factors we're going to talk about in the second part of this video, they just don't have the potential for color morph creation. They don't have the potential to ever become a color morph market. So let's start out with part one. The species must be an animal that has a large group of people that would be interested and actually willing to care for that species. So obviously, we're looking at the basic mechanics of the species itself. And there are a lot of things that can eliminate a species from ever becoming widely kept, and some of them you might not have thought of before. Obviously, some of the big ones are, is the animal dangerous? So you don't see too many people keeping Komodo dragons or lots of your really venomous snakes like your pit vipers and certainly, rattlesnakes, stuff like that. Are there people that keep them? Sure, but it's pretty hard to get a large group of people or even a medium group of people to keep an animal when one wrong mistake can be the difference between life and death. And sure, you have anti-venom, but there's no guarantee. There's all kinds of bad reactions people can have to venom. So anything venomous, or even anything, like a Komodo dragon, for example, which may not be necessarily venomous, but way too big for any one person to control, and way too dangerous to be widely kept, obviously. Even if they're not venomous, one bite, all the bacteria that is developed in their mouth, it's a very serious bite, and the chances of you surviving something like that are not great. So it can't be a species that's really dangerous. It also can't be a species that is really hard to care for. And obviously hard to care for, that could be meaning a bunch of different things. And when we look at species like Komodo dragons, when we look at species like sea turtles, for example. Sea turtles are wonderful, but even if you had a bunch of sea turtle morphs, you cannot get a bunch of people, at least with today's state of technology, to be able to house for, adequately care for, and successfully breed sea turtles. It's just not going to happen because they're way too big. And I don't want to try to make this a whole thing of size either, because there are some species that are very small species where, let's look at some salamanders, for example. Some salamanders stay underground most of the year, and their preferred temperature is in the 40s to 50s range. And anything over, let's say 70 degrees, can cause heat stroke, organ failure, because their organs are literally built to function at these lower temperatures. And if you're just trying to keep an animal at room temperature, it's not going to work. So unless you're going to have like an entire room on a chiller system, basically, where it's in the 40s or 50s, you're not going to be able to keep a species like that. Also, other species that, water is a big thing, so aquatic species. If the species requires a really in-depth aquatic setup where they need all kinds of water systems, where they need water pressure to almost, basically replicate a stream, if they need bubblers, if they need all kinds of different things with aquatic setups, it's just adding to the care factor. And if a species is not relatively easy to care for, it doesn't have to be the easiest. People keep green tree pythons, people keep emerald tree boas, the different Amazon basins, things like that. They do not have to be the easiest species to care for. That's not what I'm saying. But if the person is having to go out of their way so much to work on getting some crazy elaborate setup, it's not going to be within the skill set of most average people. And if only the most advanced keepers can keep them, you're not going to be able to develop a substantial morph market on that sense. And another thing is just that the species, the build itself, it has to be a good build that does well in captivity. And it also has to be a good build that works well with the human anatomy, in the sense that, I'll give you an example. Let's look at bullfrogs, okay? American bullfrogs. I love bullfrogs. I think they're a wonderful species. I think they're fantastic pets if you're willing to give the care that they need, and I think they do have a lot of potential, because you look at the albinos, you look at the axanthics, which are literally blue, you look at the piebalds, which are just wonderful with the white, black, and yellow, orange colors. They're fantastic. But bullfrogs do not make as good of captives as, let's say, a Pac-Man frog. Okay, bullfrogs, just the actual build of the frog itself. They're fast, they're athletic, they're slimy, they are everything you don't want a captive animal to be. If I want to go through, let's say I have a breeder, a friend of mine over, and we're going through animals, and I want to say, hey, here's this new bullfrog morph I've been working on, and I want to pull out bullfrog, I have to almost physically restrain that animal, like grabbing its back legs and like vice gripping them together, just to keep the animal steady, just to keep the animal from not getting away. And any sort of animal that has a tendency to be quicker than the person that's actually trying to contain them, slimy, so it's hard for the actual human hand to physically manage that animal, all of these things are big negatives, I love bullfrogs. They're great species. I think they do have a lot of potential, but they're never going to be the next Pac-Man frog. They're never going to be as popular as like tomato frogs, because they're fast, they're slimy, they certainly are great escape artists, and they're just not something that most people can manage. It has to be a species that is, like a Pac-Man frog. I can pull it out, it's not fast, sure, it might bite me every now and then, but it's not going to get away. It's not slimy, so I'm not having to constantly wash my hands and get this residue that many times will actually burn your hands. Let's say you have paper cuts and stuff like that. It just has to be an animal that's pleasant to interact with and pleasant to hold. And this goes back to, even the venomous stuff. anything that can cause significant damage to the person that's interacting with it, the human body, is just simply not going to be an ideal captive for creating a large morph market. Now, let's say that it is a species that is manageable. Okay, let's say it's something like a Pac-Man frog or something like a leopard gecko, where it meets all the requirements. It is easy to interact with. It is not so huge and so ridiculous in its care requirements that most people, even if it's a slight challenge, can basically figure out how to do it. It's not so hard that a person physically cannot properly care for the animal without having to invest huge amounts of time and money into the animal. Okay, it's relatively easy to care for, even if it's a challenge. It's pleasant to interact with, it doesn't bite, it's not venomous, or at least the bite isn't, really detrimental to the person in question, all of these things. One of the other big things that we have to understand in the reptile community is that there are specific roles that each reptile fills. Let's look at leopard geckos. They have basically filled the role of the small pet gecko. They are big enough that they are not going to be damaged with handling, unlike house geckos. They are friendly enough that they're not going to tear your fingers off, like tokay geckos. They are a terrestrial species, which means they don't climb, so they're very easy to manage. They're not fast. They're not flighty, typically. I mean, every now and then you might get an individual that really is fast and really doesn't want to interact with you, but that's the exception. That's not the general rule of thumb, and they're a wonderful species. They have kind of filled that role of the small pet gecko. Bearded dragons, they have filled the role of the larger lizard. So someone doesn't want that very small gecko, they want something that's pretty beefy. Bearded dragon has had that role filled. Ball pythons, they fill the role of the person that wants a snake that isn't really small, like a sand boa or a hognose snake, but not something as big as a boa or a blood python. They fill that role perfectly. We look at turtles, tortoises, frogs. Pac-Man frogs have filled the role completely of the easy-to-manage terrestrial frog that has a lot of cool color morphs and all this kind of stuff. So another thing to think about when you're looking at a species, let's say there's a species you like and you want to see it, basically, you want to see it have a morph market created. You want to see in 15 years, you're going to start working on this project, and in 10 to 15 years, people are going to talk about this market. XYZ species has a morph market. You have to take in consideration what role is the species filling. I'll go back to the leopard gecko example. There are so many amazing species of terrestrial geckos that are similar to leopard geckos. I think about things like banded geckos, which would be inclusive of the Texas banded geckos, Western banded geckos, Central American banded geckos, which are all a bit smaller and a bit more athletic than leopard geckos, but still very tame. They don't run fast, they don't climb up walls, they're not likely to bite, they're just perfect, almost like a leopard gecko. And then even, what do you have? The African fat-tailed geckos. They're very similar to leopard geckos, but you have to sit here and ask. You don't hear anybody talking about the Central American banded gecko market, okay, or the Texas banded gecko market, or even you barely ever hear people talk about the fat-tailed gecko market. And you have to ask yourself why. And the reason is that the role for the small pet gecko has already been filled by the leopard gecko. So unless the African fat-tailed gecko or the banded gecko, whatever species it might be, has some huge advantage over the leopard gecko, it's not going to replace that role. Then leopard gecko is basically going to hog all of the attention, and those species are going to have a really hard time developing themselves, because it's like, why would you work with the species? Why would you work with the Central American banded gecko, or why would you work with an African fat-tailed gecko when you can work with a leopard gecko? Okay, when you can work with a Pac-Man frog, for example. Now, like I said, if the species are having no problems, and we're in a very interesting spot right now where with leopard geckos, we're actually starting to have some problems, which is very interesting. Leopard geckos have been around forever. Basically, they were the first, really well-developed, captive-bred pet store gecko, if you will, that was actually captive bred and that people could get and be successful with. They've been around forever. But the unfortunate part about that is that because they've been around forever, they have come from countries that, since being imported into the United States, these countries have made laws where they cannot be exported anymore from those countries. The United States has gotten into all kinds of crazy wars, which has put restrictions from some of these countries like Pakistan, and it is very hard, I don't want to say impossible, but very hard to get wild bloodstock from leopard geckos out of the wild anymore. And not only that, but they've been hybridized, so people have bred different species together, not kept accurate records, and all of these things, the inbreeding, the hybridization of these different species of leopard geckos, has come to a point now where a lot of the morphs, a lot of the line-bred traits, not all of them, but enough of them, are starting to have problems. They're starting to have inbreeding problems, they're starting to have genetic problems, things like that, and we're actually just seeing some of these other species of geckos, like Central American banded geckos, and especially like African fat-tailed geckos, starting to gain popularity, and not replace the leopard gecko per se, but certainly a lot of breeders are leaving leopard geckos and going to African fat-tailed geckos, because the leopard gecko did fill the role of the classic pet gecko species you're going to find in a pet store, but they're starting to have problems. And now, because of that, these other species, like the African fat-tailed gecko, are starting to take over, and I would say within the next 15 to 20 years, I don't think the leopard gecko is going to be replaced as the classic pet store gecko, but I think that unless things change, in 15 to 20 years, there could be no, or basically no, leopard gecko market left, and everybody that wants to breed geckos, the leopard geckos will be the pet store animals, but if you really want to breed morphs, if you really want to do it seriously as a breeding project, fat-tailed geckos may be the way to go. Okay, so if you're looking at a species, it has to be a species that, again, we're talking about filling the role of animals. The African fat-tailed gecko is gaining popularity because the current contender, the current species that has filled that role of the small pet gecko, is starting to have problems as far as breeding and genetics go. And even though they're still great animals and they'll probably continue for the next 50 years to be that classic pet store gecko, things are changing. Okay, but that's an exception. That's not the rule. We look at things like ball pythons. Okay, ball pythons are having no inbreeding problems. The morphs are better than ever. The market is better than ever. It's going to be practically impossible for any species to overtake that role because they've had the role for so long and they're such a great species with basically no problems. The only problem is that, there's so many people working with them. Sometimes there's an overproduction of the species. Because of that, you're not going to overthrow the ball python. Not anytime soon. I guess that if, within the next couple years, if we did, maybe the genetics of ball pythons did get closed off, you could hypothetically say that in 30 to 40 years, maybe we have some sort of inbreeding crisis happen, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. And even if we did have the blood cut off where we can't get new imports in, I still think ball pythons can go a very long time without any sort of inbreeding problems as long as people are responsible and outcross as much as possible. So hopefully you guys kind of understand what I'm saying. When you have a species and you're looking at it, you have to ask the question, is it fulfilling or is it filling a new role that is not already filled by another species? Or could this be a species that maybe fixes some of the problems of the current staple in the industry, like African fat-tailed geckos are doing for leopard geckos? And another good example of this that I just thought of would be blood pythons, just to give you another example. Right now, there is a huge demand for a large snake. Everyone loves retics. Everyone loves Burmese. That, the thought of just having this big, beefy, huge snake is the thing that everybody wants. Everybody wants a retic. Everyone wants a Burmese python. But let's be realistic. Even a small Burmese python or a small reticulated python is a very large animal and a very strong animal, and that one that can very easily overpower its owner. Even the strongest bodybuilder, you take the strongest man on earth and you put him against the largest reticulated python on earth, not trying to discourage anyone from keeping these animals, but they are much stronger than you, and the human body is not built to be able to fight off, as in if the snake is coiled around you, something like a reticulated python or Burmese python. So that's where we go to blood pythons, because they have the girth of a very large reticulated python. Like, I bet a 18-foot reticulated python is about as thick as a 5-foot blood python. Okay, so they have the huge girth of a massive snake. They have the head of a large snake too. They have very big heads compared to the size of their body, but they're short, as is in the name short-tailed pythons. They are very short. They are not going to be a threat to their owner in any way. A bite could be severe, especially if it's a food-driven bite, but you never have to worry about a blood python basically overpowering its owner. And some people might think that the role of a big, small snake, if you will, a snake that's small enough to be impressive, or I should say small enough to not be dangerous, but big enough to be impressive. Some people think that role is already filled by the ball python, and I could not disagree more. Ball pythons, they can be impressive, especially if you're new to snakes, but after you've gotten to snakes for a while, even the largest female still just seems like a, relatively reasonable snake, whereas a big, massive, like a 6-foot blood python that's just as thick as a 20-foot reticulated python is still very impressive. So we've seen blood pythons really starting to take over on the scene. And while it's still going to be probably 15 or 20 years until they're the size of, let's say, boa constrictors, they are outcompeting some species like boa constrictors on many fronts, because boas, they have for the longest time been the big, small snake, big enough to be impressive, but small enough to not be a threat. And we're seeing lots of people moving, instead of getting boas, now they're getting blood pythons, because the blood pythons are fulfilling that role of the big, just huge, girthy snake without all of the risks of, let's say, a 10-foot boa or something like that. So I hope you guys kind of get an idea what I'm talking about. If you're looking at a species and you're wondering, can this species become the next morph market? Can it become the next ball python, the next leopard gecko, or can it compete with these species? Ask yourself, is it fulfilling a role that isn't currently filled, like the blood python is doing very well, or is it replacing a role that already is filled, but it's fixing lots of the problems that the species has, going back to leopard geckos, African fat-tail geckos, no inbreeding problems at all. We can get new blood in with the snap of a finger. They're basically, I don't want to say free, but they're very cheap to get in from Africa. These are all things you want to consider when you're picking a project and when you're asking the question, can this species become the next ball python? Can this species become the next leopard gecko? Now, the second part of this video is the much bigger and broader part. So let's say that you do have a species that fits all of the criteria we talked about in part 1. Easy to manage, not too hard to care for, and it is fulfilling a specific role that either isn't fulfilled already, like the blood python is doing, or it's fixing some of the problems with the current industry staple, like African fat-tailed geckos are doing for leopard geckos. Let's say it meets all those criteria, okay? Now we actually break into the color morphs themselves, because this is a big thing. You have tons of species out there that might be even better than ball pythons, okay? They might be better to care for, or easier to care for. They don't have the feeding problems of ball pythons, but because they don't meet the morph requirements, they are never going to take off and become a morph market of their own. So in the reptile market today, there are two main ways that color morphs are created. The first is through genetic mutations, so things like albino, leucistic, piebald, melanistic. These are genetic mutations in the genetic code where a color morph mutated and it is replicatable. It is something that is genetic that can be passed on to other offspring. Or the second way that color morphs are created is through line breeding, meaning that, hey, we have a leopard gecko and we have a bunch of leopard geckos and we're breeding them, and we notice that one of them is starting to have kind of this reduced pattern look, and we breed that to make more and more reduced babies. Every generation, we hold back the babies that are more and more reduced, and over 5, 10, 15 generations, we go from having a leopard gecko that is almost pure black because it has so many spots on it, to a leopard gecko that is literally completely patternless. No pattern on the head, no pattern on the back, almost no pattern on the tail. That is line breeding. Now, each one of these ways that morphs are created have their own pros and cons. So let's start out with genetic mutations, because they are by far the most common way that morph markets are really developed. You look at ball pythons, for example, and boa constrictors. While there are some line-bred traits in ball pythons, and the same thing can be said with boa constrictors, they are dominated by genetic mutations, and if it wasn't for genetic mutations, boas or ball pythons would be nowhere close to where they are today. So what are some of the pros of genetic mutations? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's only really one main pro to genetic mutations, which is that they are genetic, which means that they are directly inheritable. Sometimes you have line-bred traits and you line breed them for generation after generation and nothing ever comes out of the line breeding. Whereas genetic mutations, it's very simple. You have an albino, breed it to a normal, make your hets, breed them back, and it is genetic, and it also is in the sense that it is truly a mutation. So because it's a mutation, it is inheritable. It's not going to be a dead end like some line breeding projects are, and because it is genetic, it changes the color palette. When you're line breeding with any animal, if you're line breeding with the normal color palette, like you are with leopard geckos in most cases, you're working with the normal color palette. Almost think about it like a selection of paint. Okay, you have the normal selection of paint, which is nice, but when you have a genetic mutation, like a piebald, or an albino especially, now you're working with a different palette of paint. The actual colors that you can manipulate are different. You know, you look at ball pythons, for example. The only colors you have to really manipulate are browns, blacks, maybe some yellow and some white. But now when we add an albino, we have oranges and, neon yellow, pastel yellow, all kinds of creams and whites, all these different crazy things. Then we add in a pastel. Now we have all these golds and, different kind of dirty browns and lemon yellows and things like that. Then we add in a Mojave or an Axanthic. All these different mutations, and they're actually physically changing the color palette that we can work with the animals. So that is the biggest pro of mutations. Now, unfortunately, mutations also come with a huge con, in the sense that genetic mutations are a pure numbers game, meaning that the amount of animals that you have in a population is directly correlated to the amount of mutations that there are going to be. Certainly, there are probably some outside factors that can affect, maybe if a certain animal lives in an environment that's a bit more radioactive, if you will. I'm not talking about, nuclear level radioactive, but slightly more radioactive. You could make the argument that potentially that would make the likelihood for mutations to be more, but generally it's a numbers game. So if I have a population that has 100 million individuals in XYZ population versus another species that only has 10,000 individuals in the wild, obviously the species that has 100 million is going to have a huge amount of mutations, while the population that only has 10,000 over, let's say 10,000 year span is only going to generate a very small amount of mutations. It's all a numbers game. So, if you're working with a species, and it's the most wonderful species ever, but they have a very small range on a very small island in Indonesia or something like that, whatever place in the world it might be, if there's only 10,000 individuals or even 100,000 individuals in the wild, good luck getting many morphs. Maybe you get albino, maybe you get melanistic, maybe you get leucistic if the species has been around for a long time, but there's not a very good chance of any morphs mutating. So when you're looking at mutations, it really has to be a species that is widespread. Things like ball pythons, things like corn snakes. These animals have huge ranges in their countries of origin, hundreds of millions of individuals. Some of the species probably have billions of individuals in their respective countries, and they've been around forever. Like ball pythons have probably been in Africa basically unchanged for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. So any mutations that we see spider ball pythons right now, that mutation could have mutated 20,000 years ago. We have no clue how old these mutations are and how long they've been floating around in the environment. So when you have a population of individuals, being reptiles or amphibians, it's all a numbers game. If there's a lot of individuals in the wild, you're going to have a lot of mutations. If there's not, you're not. So it's one of those things where it really is limiting if you're just going to rely on genetic mutations. You better have a species that has a lot of wild individuals, or it's not going to go anywhere. Maybe you get albino, maybe get melanistic, but that's about it. Another con of obviously working with just genetic mutations is that you have to actually go through those individuals. So it's one thing to have a species that has 100 million individuals in the wild. It's like, great. You have to go through that many species or that many individuals to actually find the morphs and mutations in that species. So there's a couple different ways this can happen. Let's look at ball pythons, because these are by far the easiest example. Ball pythons for the longest time have been the go-to pet trade animal that you see in pet shops. And people over in Africa, the reptile, I don't want to say breeders, but certainly the reptile catchers over in Ghana and Togo, also some have come from Benin, have, figured out that there's a huge market for this. So they would go out, catch wild, caught female ball pythons that were gravid, meaning that they were pregnant, bring them into their facilities, which were many times just sheds or modified garages, set them up in these styrofoam boxes or big bins, hatch out the babies, and then sell them to the pet trade. And over the span of just, let's say, 15 years, literally millions of ball pythons came from this source, meaning that African reptile catchers would go out, get female ball pythons that were gravid, bring them in, have them lay their eggs, the babies would hatch, and they would get sent over to the reptile trade. In Asia, the United States imported a ridiculous amount of ball pythons, and this happened literally for millions and millions of ball pythons. So right there, you have literally a system where these ball pythons come into the United States, people know ball pythons have morphs, people know the value of the morphs, so every single animal of that millions of animals that were exported get evaluated. Not only by the Africans, but also by the people that have them, get shipped in, let's say, just to the United States. And there's literally been, like assembly lines where these facilities are importing, let's just say 100,000 ball pythons for the pet trade, okay, which is a pretty big number. 100,000 ball pythons come in, they have a big group of people, they're going through, they look, this one's normal, holy crap, this one really has something going on. There's something with the eye, maybe the belly has some sort of color, the pattern is just insane, and they pick that animal out and they say, bam, here's a morph. If a system like that does not exist, you are not going to be able to find the morphs in the first place. So like I said, even if you are lucky enough to have a species that has 100 million individuals or more in the wild, and they've been there for a while, it's not like an invasive species or something like that that just got established, then you have to have a system to actually evaluate all these individuals and find the mutations, almost like pulling a needle out of a haystack. Now, it doesn't have to be a systematic process like I just described with the ball pythons. It could also just be herpers. You look at corn snakes and hognose snakes. Those are two huge markets, with the hognose snakes really basically blowing up over the past 10 years, and almost all of those morphs have come from herpers. And it just so happens to be that hognose snakes and corn snakes are quite easy to find in the wild, and they're also a species that is like a target species on many herpers' list. So lots of people, they're out there, they're looking for reptiles, they find a hognose snake, it looks pretty weird, pretty interesting, they find a breeder, they sell it to the breeder, and the morph gets established in captivity. So it doesn't have to be like a really systematic business approach like it is with the ball pythons or like it's been with some other species, but there has to be an easy way to evaluate these large groups of animals to actually extract these morphs. If it's a species that has 100 million individuals, but they're all in countries that won't let you export the morphs, or maybe it's a species that's a ground-dwelling species and they're so hard to find, they're so hard to assess and actually get in large numbers that there could be who knows how many genetic mutations in that species. But if you can't access them, you can't evaluate the species, it's a dead end. It's never going to become a large or even medium scale morph market. Now this brings us to line breeding. So we just talked about some of the big cons of genetic mutations. Now let's look at line breeding. So line breeding is basically the exact opposite of genetic mutations, meaning that you do not have to have a large amount of blood stock. There is always something that can be improved with the individual stock that you have currently. I mean, certainly, I guess there's some exceptions like black racers, any snake that's just a solid color, there's not really much you're going to do with that, but generally, you can take a species and there's something you can improve upon it, okay? Maybe it's a little thing, maybe it's something huge like with leopard geckos. Most of the morphs in leopard geckos today are not genetic mutations. They're results of somebody saying, hey, we're producing these geckos, there's this really interesting trait that we're seeing, let's see if over 10, 20, 30 generations, we can actually turn this into something that would be, valuable, that would be useful in the leopard gecko market. So with line breeding, you don't have to have a huge amount of a species. So if you can only get a couple thousand individuals of XYZ species, you can line breed them and actually work on projects without genetic mutations. So that's the great thing about line breeding. Line breeding also tends to hold its value better than a lot of the genetic mutations, especially in things like amphibians, because while you can very easily mass produce things like albino, because you breed an albino to an albino, all the babies are albino. Most of the time with line breeding, it isn't that cut and dry. Most of the time with line breeding, there's like, let's just say you're breeding, I don't know, a reduced pattern frog. Okay, we have a frog, we're breeding for reduced pattern. You're going to have variation. So a low expression reduced pattern gene still has some pattern. It's nice, but it's not going to be nearly as valued as one that is completely patternless. So it's much harder to mass produce line bred traits, and hence they typically hold their value better over time. Now, what is some of the huge cons of line breeding? Now, this is something we talked about when we just talked about the pros of genetic mutations. When you have a genetic mutation, it's actually changing the physical color palette. Basically, if you're thinking about it as paint, it's changing the palette of paint that you can work with when you're making this living art, okay? When you're working with line breeding, you are working with the normal phenotype of that animal. So like a leopard gecko. Typically, obviously, you could line breed with things like albino. You could line breed maybe with traits like piebald, but a lot of your other genetic mutations like leucistic and melanistic aren't able to be line bred. So typically, you're working with the standard normal type pigmentation. So if we're working with something like a Pac-Man frog, for example, Pac-Man frogs have browns, greens, maybe some yellows, maybe some whites. We can line breed them and do all these kind of crazy things, but unless we have an albino, unless we have a piebald or melanistic, we're never going to be able to line breed to make some of the crazy things that you can produce with color mutations. So line breeding is in some ways limited in its what you can actually make. You're limited by the normal color palette. And this also comes into the second con when it comes to line breeding versus genetic mutations in terms of creating a market for these morphs, is that not all species are equal when it comes to line breeding. Not every species, most species actually are not going to be as polygenic as, let's say, a leopard gecko or a Pac-Man frog, which are both two species that are extremely polygenic. I mean, you look at the stuff that's produced with Pac-Man frogs, all the mutants and all of the, reduced patterns and emeralds and peppermints and strawberry, pineapple albinos. I mean, all just crazy stuff with Pac-Man frogs. And then you go to leopard geckos and you see the reverse stripe and the Halloween and the, orange crush, super hypo tangerine, carrot tail, baldy, all this crazy stuff in leopard geckos. These are all coming from line bred traits. But the problem is that most species are not going to be a leopard gecko or a Pac-Man frog. Most species, like you look at things like even ball pythons are nowhere near as polygenic as leopard geckos and Pac-Man frogs. They are polymorphic, meaning they have many genetic mutations that we're working with in captivity, but they are not polygenic. I mean, you take a normal ball python, you can make them more reduced and patterned. You can make them, maybe more busy in pattern. You could maybe make the browns darker or lighter. There's small things like that you can do, but you're not going to get to the crazy level of leopard geckos or Pac-Man frogs. So for a lot of the species, they're limited and they cannot be line bred like a leopard gecko or a Pac-Man frog. So almost in the same way that with genetic mutations, you need a species that has a lot of individuals in the wild. So there's actually a good chance for genetic mutations to exist. With line breeding, you need a species that actually has the ability to be line bred. Okay, I look at things like black racers, for example. Beautiful snakes, so there's crisp black. I don't see how you're going to line breed those guys. Okay, you can't really make the black any blacker. You can't really make the black any lighter. It's just black. So they do not have barely any line breeding potential at all. Same thing with ball pythons. Like I said, they are not very polygenic. It's not something where you're going to make an entire market just out of breeding ball pythons. It's just not going to happen. That's why they need the mutations. So if you have a species like a leopard gecko or a Pac-Man frog, great. Pac-Man frogs really only have one mutation, which are the albinos, and leopard geckos only have a handful of mutations, like the snow, patternless, and different lines of albinos, like the Tremper albino or the rainwater albino. but they still have huge markets, even though they don't have many morphs, because they have that line breeding potential. So when you're analyzing a species and you're saying, well, they're not going to have many mutations, can they be a species that can be line bred? You have to look for genetic variation, and not all genetic variation is even created in the same class of species. You look at something like, let's look at toads, for example. It's not just that geckos are, basically, let me backtrack a little bit, like I just said with leopard geckos. It isn't just such that, I don't want you guys to basically look at this and go, well, leopard geckos are very polygenic, so other similar gecko species like African fat-tailed geckos are going to be very polygenic. It doesn't work like that. Certainly African fat-tailed geckos are polygenic, but not on the same caliber as leopard geckos. Central American banded geckos are also very polygenic, but not on the same level as leopard geckos. Look at toads, like American toads versus southern toads. American toads, very stagnant, whereas southern toads are extremely, the variation that you see in those guys is just insane. So you have to have a species, if you're going to have line breeding be the main way that the market is developed, it has to be a species that can actually be line bred. I know that's something that maybe people don't think of, because the way that line bred is sold many times is that you can take any species and just inbreed it a bunch and hold back a bunch of babies, and you're just going to make all this crazy stuff, and it doesn't work like that, guys. It has to be a species that is open to genetic manipulation through line breeding, and a species that has a lot of genetic variation. Now, the last point I want to talk about when it comes to both genetic mutations and line breeding, when we're talking about, the species that we're talking about, in order to develop a morph market, it has to have the potential for color morph creation. The last part I want to talk about is not necessarily about mutations versus color morphs, or I should say mutations versus line breeding, but it's about the species itself, because you could take something like black racers, for example. I don't want to pick on these guys too much, but I've used them for a couple examples in this podcast. Black racers, they're basically a solid black snake. You can't really line breed them, but even if you could get a bunch of crazy mutations, you could get a piebald, you could get a melanistic. Well, actually, you wouldn't need a melanistic with a black racer, but you could get a piebald, a leucistic, an albino, maybe a hypo, a couple other genetic mutations. That is still not going to create a big market for black racers. They're not going to create a black racer market, and that is because the black racer simply is not a good candidate to be a morph market. One of the things, I use this analogy a lot when I'm talking to people. Look at a ball python versus a milk snake. A ball python in itself, compared to a standard, milk snake, like a Pueblin's milk snake or a Honduran milk snake or something, if I ask people, which is more beautiful? Almost everybody, I would say 90% of people, are going to go with the milk snake. But when we actually look at which has a larger morph market, the ball python is easily, by far, the most. It's way bigger than any milk snake. I don't care how many albinos or different line bred traits milk snakes have. Ball pythons are the victor. They are way bigger, infinitely bigger than any milk snake market. You could even take all the markets and put them together. So you might ask yourself, why? Why are milk snakes, which are easily ranked much more beautiful than a standard ball python, why is their market so stagnant, but ball pythons are so, just huge? And it all comes down to being a good candidate for a morph market. Milk snakes, they're beautiful. They really are beautiful animals with the, red stripes and the yellow and the black. It just looks so beautiful. They're just stunning animals, but they're very stagnant. There is not much variation in many milk snake species, and you get an albino. That's great. You can get maybe you can get a leucistic. That's great. They don't have much genetic variation. When people want to have a morph market, they want the nitty gritty, which is what ball pythons do best. It's what corn snakes do best. It's what boas do best. Let's look at ball pythons, for example. Let's say we're working with spider ball pythons. I want a spider ball python that's more yellow. Bam, I give it a pastel. I want a spider ball python that's really yellow. Bam, I give it an orange dream, or I give it an albino, which is just insane. I want a spider ball python that has more white. I give it a calico. I want a spider ball python that's darker. I give it a black pastel. I give it a cinnamon. I want a spider ball python that's more reduced. I give it a pinstripe, or I give it an enchi or a super enchi. I want a spider ball python that looks like this or that. We have all this genetic variation with the mutations in in ball pythons. Now I can go back to leopard geckos. Let's say you're working with a leopard gecko project, and you're working with a striped leopard gecko project, and you say, I want this project to be more reduced. Okay, let's say it's kind of busy. I want it to really get it more reduced. I can give this leopard gecko project, we can outcross it with some hypo leopard geckos to make things more reduced. Let's say I want it more orange. I can outcross my striped project with some tangerine leopard geckos to make the project more on the orange side of things. Having that nitty-gritty, having that variation is so critical and so important, and it's why, even though there are some beautiful species like milk snakes, they simply do not thrive in the morph market environment. Okay, they're beautiful in their own right. Tons of tree frogs out there. You look at like red-eyed tree frogs, and honestly, red-eyed tree frogs probably aren't the best example because they are developing a decent morph market because they have so many crazy morphs. But you look at some of the other Amazonian species of tree frogs and stuff like that that come from not just the Amazon, but Central and South America. You look at these species, they're beautiful. They're way more beautiful than, let's say, a Pac-Man frog. Okay, they're way more beautiful than, let's say, a southern toad. But why did they not have anywhere near the potential of a Pac-Man frog or a southern toad? Because they don't have that variation. They're just not the best candidates for a morph market. They're not the best candidates to have that genetic variation. And it isn't anything to do with line breeding. Okay, I want to make that crystal clear. I use the example of ball pythons. They have tons of variation, but it's with mutations. But there has to be that availability for variation. It has to be built into their genetic code. And if it's not, they're just simply not a species that is built or deemed for greatness when it comes to being successful in the current day morph market. So I hope you guys did enjoy today's podcast, and I hope that this kind of gives you guys a better insight into my own thoughts. And again, this is just all my own thoughts that I've had over the past, 5-6 years about what makes or breaks a reptile species as far as developing into a morph market. So if you're out there and you're looking at a lesser known species that not many people are working with, and you're wondering, could this be the next big thing? Could this be the next big species, whether it be a snake or lizard or frog, that's going to take over the market in 5 to 10 years and really be something that I should invest some time and effort into? Hopefully this video just gives you guys a bit of a layout as far as that is concerned in terms of what species could develop into a morph market, which species probably wouldn't in the future. If you want to see more podcasts like this, be sure to give this video a like, be sure to leave a comment down below, and of course subscribe to the Benjamin's Exotics podcast channel. Thanks for listening to today's podcast, and I'll see you guys soon.